43 years of relations finished overnight. Voters in Britain have chosen to leave the European Union, a result that has shocked many and led to deep soul-searching across the continent. So how divided is the United Kingdom? And where do the UK and EU go from here? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. The United Kingdom has decided to cut its ties with the European Union and become the first major economy to leave the 28-member bloc. It's the culmination of 4 months of bitter campaigning that has exposed deep rifts in British society. But it's also the result of years of skepticism about the EU in the UK, where Brussels and EU officials are often perceived as unaccountable political elites who have too much power over the lives of British people. That's a statement disputed by those who campaigned for the UK to remain in the EU. But this vote was as much about emotion and disillusionment with the status quo as it was about Britain's future in the EU. The result has sent shockwaves across Europe and the world and forced the man who promised the referendum in the first place, Prime Minister David Cameron, to resign. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
The British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but I do believe it's in the national interest to have a period of stability and then the new leadership required.
Former London Mayor Boris Johnson has been an outspoken supporter of the Leave campaign. He says the EU has become too remote, too opaque, and not accountable enough to the people it's meant to serve.
The British people have spoken up for democracy in Britain and across Europe, and I think we can be very proud of the result. Thank you finally to everybody at Vote Leave for the extraordinary and positive campaign you have run. Thank you.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says a Brexit is democratically unacceptable to Scotland and that it may now consider leaving the UK.
The Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. Scotland does now face that prospect. It is a significant and material change in circumstances, and it is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table.
The referendum results were close, but while the numbers show an almost split vote, the map does not quite reflect that. People in Scotland overwhelmingly voted to stay in the European Union, which means they may demand a vote of their own, a second referendum on whether they should remain part of the UK. People in Northern Ireland also chose to stay in the EU, but most of England and Wales voted to leave. London was the exception. 60% of voters there were in the Remain camp. Time to bring in our guests for the discussion in Rome. Joining us on Skype, Jonathan Portes, Principal Research Fellow at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. And in London, Charlie Wells, European Features Editor for the Wall Street Journal. And welcome to both of you, gentlemen. I think that the news is still coming over people in waves. The story just has that much gravity. I'm going to start with you, Jonathan. Mr. Portes, why did the Leave campaign win?
Well, the referendum was basically about two things. Were the British electorate ready to take the economic risk of Brexit in return for taking back control over immigration policy? And most political scientists, most politicians assumed that ultimately economic risk outweighed the rather notional gains of having greater control over immigration. And they were wrong. In the end, the electorate decided, narrowly but decisively, that they were prepared to take the economic risk despite all the warnings from economists like me, because they want to get back control over immigration policy. It's pretty much as simple as that.
Charlie, do you agree with that assessment?
Essentially, and one of the things that we've really seen is this issue of inequality. So the United Kingdom is an incredibly unequal place. London is, as we can see behind me, a bustling, beautiful capital city. And yet in rural England, there are people who struggle to find meaningful work and who have not seen the sort of economic benefits that a lot of experts talked about and continued to extol throughout the campaign.
I mean, I think that's quite true that, the UK is a very unequal, and there were very sharp divisions visible in this referendum. But equally, remember, London is very unequal, and indeed, where I'm not in London at the moment, but I live in Islington in London. Islington has a lot of relatively well-off people like me, but it also has one of the highest poverty rates in the country. It's rated as one of the top 10 or 20 deprived areas in the country by any measure. And yet Islington voted by an overwhelming majority to remain, by 70% or so. Whereas you can go to quite prosperous areas of the countryside that actually decided to vote for leave, even though they're doing quite well. So you do see this very sharp demographic and regional split, but it's not quite as simple as just saying that the less well-off people voted for exit and the better-off voted for remain.
And we will talk about some more of the divisions in just a moment, but I want to bring someone else into the conversation now. I'm happy to say we can bring in John Hilary. He's the Executive Director of War on Want. And John, we appreciate you joining this conversation as well. So is it fair to describe this vote, the Leave vote, as a way that people who felt marginalized, felt empowered by making this move? Do you agree with that characterization?
I think it is right to an extent. I think that a lot of people have felt left behind by the politicians, by the political elites, both in Britain and in the European Union. And I think for a lot of people, this was their one chance to say, do you know what, we don't believe in all of the so-called experts, all of the promises, all of the hype that has been put out in this campaign. We're going to base our vote on our personal experience, and our personal experience hasn't been as rosy as you're trying to portray the European Union as being. And I think that's a much closer approximation, that this is a rejection of the political elites, both in Britain and across Europe as a whole.
So a protest vote of sorts, a protest vote that you were voting against something maybe as opposed to for something?
Well, I think that there is also a sense that people want it to be for an alternative. It's not clear perhaps for everybody
what is that alternative,
for the same alternative. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, for people who have more politically maybe worked out alternatives on the left, it's an alternative which says no to austerity, all of the austerity programs which are crushing the poorest and most vulnerable in our society, and saying yes to the reinvestment in manufacturing, the recreation of good jobs across the country, not just based in London, which has got so much wealth in comparison to other more marginalised bits, particularly of the big cities of the rest of England. And also a positive message which says we can build multicultural societies, but there needs to be investment to ensure that the benefits for one bit of society are not at the expense of the other.
So we've talked about why the Leave campaign won. Charlie, why did the Remain campaign fail?
You know, one of the things that people have been saying is that the Remain campaign focused a lot on economic arguments, talking about the benefits of Europeanization, the benefits of, a common market, and those sorts of arguments don't tend to resonate so well with people. We really saw shifts in the polls when the debate turned towards immigration. I think we all remember that very striking image of a crowd of migrants, supposedly streaming towards Europe, and those sort of heartfelt, emotional arguments really seem to strike a chord with the electorate here, especially in towns that, have seen, mass influxes of immigration over the past few years. Boston is an example of a town here in the UK that has changed significantly. The Wall Street Journal wrote a very in-depth story about residents in that town worried about what they saw as changes to British cultural values, and whether or not those cultural values are changing or not. That proved to be a very effective, motivation for the the Leave campaign and why Remain didn't seem to fare as well.
So, Charlie, I guess I'm maybe asking you to read minds a little bit, but we have heard that there's been some of this is a pushback against changing cultural values. What does that really mean, though? What are people saying when they say that?
That's tough to say. I mean, one of the continuing points in this debate has been there's been sort of dog whistle racism, essentially this idea that people use coded language to talk about people from other countries, from other religions, from other nationalities, and that has made the debate ugly in a lot of minds. And I think that, you know, there was sort of a point when that poster came out, when people were sort of thinking, you know, potentially, you know, this will go the other way, that we're going to sort of turn away from this sort of kind of hate-fueled speech. A number of politicians sort of switched sides late in the game. That didn't push the Remain campaign over the edge.
Jonathan, a moment ago, John, to make the different distinction there, a moment ago, John said that for the voters that supported Leave, a lot of it was a rejection of what the experts said. And Charlie said that a lot of these numbers arguments just didn't register with people so much. A bit of a pushback. In some ways, was it much more of an emotional vote and a rejection of actual facts?
Well, it was to some extent. So, for example, the Leave campaign made the claim that we would save £350 million a year in our contribution to the EU budget. Now, you know, we do make a significant contribution to the budget, and it was perfectly legitimate for the Leave campaign to argue that we would save that. But the 350 million figure was simply a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. The people who were talking about it on the Leave campaign knew full well it was a lie, and yet it turned out to be quite effective, despite people like me, not only the Remain campaign, but people like me and other independent experts saying that it was a lie. So there is a sense that in some ways, some of the debate was at least sort of post-fact politics, and that is, I think, quite depressing for a lot of us. So I think, you know, was this to some extent a cultural thing? I think that's right. It is quite complicated, remember. So, for example, you know, I was in Boston in Lincolnshire myself for a debate just a couple of weeks ago. And it's true that people there is a significant reaction there to the influx of immigrants. But remember, those immigrants are almost entirely white, almost entirely from other parts of Europe. This was not about, for the residents of Boston, was not about racism. There was indeed no particular concern there about floods of refugees or Turks. They were dealing with the influx that they're seeing right now, which is actually from elsewhere in Europe. So it's not, it is actually quite a complex set of issues. I would just say that when John says that this is a vote against austerity, I think, frankly, that is complete nonsense, I'm afraid. The British electorate had their chance just a year ago to vote against austerity when they were offered a choice of Ed Miliband and David Cameron, and they chose David Cameron. Now they've been offered, they were offered something which said, yes, you can have nice things if you vote for Brexit. But that does not in any meaningful sense translate to a rejection of austerity.
Jonathan, let me let John Hilary respond to that.
Yes, I think that's a bit unfair, because your question earlier was, what about the alternatives? And for those of us who've been trying to create a more positive agenda on the left, it has exactly been about trying to fight back against austerity. And so we come out of a debate which has been very nasty and very divisive, and as all of the other contributors have said, has focused on migrant labour, on immigration as an issue in a very negative and really quite infuriating way for most of us. What we've tried to do is to say, right, we've now got a situation where we're coming out of Europe, a Europe which is itself dedicated towards austerity. What we can hope to do now is to build a new type of politics which will challenge austerity from below and begin to start taking into account the disenfranchised voters who've all voted in these massive numbers. And again, that's where I think that the turnout of this referendum is important, because it shows a lot of people who didn't vote in the general election last year were prepared to come out here because they knew that their vote actually counted. And so I think that it is still a very important protest vote against a political elite which has not taken into account the needs of ordinary working people.
Charlie, what of the divide the different groups that voted to leave. There was a huge gap when it comes to ages. Younger people overwhelmingly wanted to stay, whereas older people did not. London wanted to stay. Scotland wanted to stay. Can you put some of these gaps in perspective for us?
Right. Well, one of the things that we saw here was just how different the United Kingdom is. Obviously, England and Wales were the only, large regions to vote in favor of leaving, whereas Scotland and Northern Ireland wanted to remain. Young voters tended to be very much in favor. These are young people who may have never known anything but living under the EU and may have seen the sort of benefits of travel, of potentially, moving abroad for stints and what have you, versus older voters who maybe don't recognize Britain and haven't seen as many of the benefits of Europeanization. And I think that's one of the really big themes here. It's not necessarily about inequality, but it's certainly about seeing the benefits of the EU. Do you see those in your daily life or not? That seemed to push a lot of people on one side or the other.
John, does the Leave side have a point when they say the EU has been out of touch?
I think absolutely. I mean, I've worked for 20 years trying to change European Union trade policy from within. Hours and hours of weeks of campaigning and lobbying for that type of change. And time and again, we've come up against a brick wall of European Commission officials who are unelected, unaccountable, who just said, we don't need to listen to you. We don't have a mandate from the people. We're not accountable. And I think that was also shown very clearly in the Greek crisis last year, where you had the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, saying to the people of Athens, don't believe that if you vote for a new party with a new agenda, you can change anything. And I quote him exactly, there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. And I think that sense of almost contempt from the European elites to the peoples of Europe has fed through into a lot of the debates that I was present at. I took part in scores of debates up and down the country where people were absolutely outraged at the fact that they had been so disenfranchised from bureaucrats in Brussels. So I do think that there's a democratic issue at heart here, even if people don't necessarily know exactly what they want to claim back. The fight is definitely on to reclaim democracy at home.
Okay, let's talk more about that. Jonathan, the Scottish First Minister has basically said that they will likely have a referendum in Scotland because people there overwhelmingly voted to remain. But she also said that this should be a moment to reflect on politics in the UK. How do you see that necessarily playing out going forward? Some of the takeaways from this, some of the lessons from this?
Well, I think the Scotland issue will become a long-running crisis. There won't be a referendum in Scotland next week or next month, maybe not next year. But this will now become not just a two-way negotiation between the UK and the rest of the European Union about the terms of our exit, but a negotiation between the Westminster government and the Scottish, and to some extent the different players in Northern Ireland, all of which will become extremely messy and complicated. So I think one thing that is reasonably foreseeable is a state of sort of semi-permanent political crisis in the UK for at least the next year or so. I wish I could share John's optimism about the likely rejuvenation of politics from the ground up in the UK. I have to say I'm rather skeptical. So, for example, although turnout was indeed up, Charlie was talking about young voters earlier. The figures I've seen suggested that despite the rather high turnout overall, only 3 in 10 voters between the ages of 18 to 24 voted, whereas the figure for voters over 65 was more like 3 in 4 or 4 in 5. And that, of course, is why we have the result that we have. Rather than, I think the most obvious demographic factor, which is one you've just described, is one where we essentially have a political system where the relatively, the older people call the shots. And that does not seem to be terribly much in the long-term interests of the UK.
So, Charlie, I see you nodding. Do you see this as leading to even more fractured communities, a wider gap between the groups that disagree?
It's fascinating. I think there's sort of two elements here. One is media. We live in an increasingly atomized media landscape where, your social media feed can sort of be dictated by you, and sort of your truth can almost be created. I've been seeing all day, posts across Facebook, across Twitter about people. Of course, I'm here in London. People across London who just can't believe that this could have happened. Or I'm sure that there are others who have curated, their social media streams in other ways that make them, totally confident in this having happened. And I think the other element here is mainstream parties. I think this is a warning to mainstream parties across the West that they need to engage with communities who feel disenfranchised. As an American here in London, I've heard so many comparisons to the Leave campaign to the Donald Trump insurgency. Of course, Donald Trump is here in the UK today, and Donald Trump has also been sort of pushed by the same kind of anti-establishment group of people who feel like they're not being listened to by mainstream institutions. And so I think that's certainly a direction and a change that a lot of these mainstream parties need to make. We
haven't talked about David Cameron yet, who obviously has tendered his resignation. He'll be leaving in a few months. Whether he had called for this referendum or not, which there's been a lot of criticism about that, a lot of analysis about that, was this tipping point inevitable, John, whether he had called for this referendum or not?
I think it was. I mean, we've certainly heard from people within the Conservative Party that was mounting criticism of him, and that it was only a matter of time before he had to go anyway. And it was clear that if there had been, as there was, a vote against remaining in the EU, he would have to go sooner rather than later. And I think he's sort of prolonged his stay by saying it needs to be done by the Conservative Party conference in the autumn. But I think the really key thing now is for us as a country to start asking more profound questions than whether or not there's a changing of the guard at number 10 Downing Street. Because exactly as we've just heard, there is a sense in which a whole generation is feeling disenfranchised, is not feeling listened to. And I think that is something where both political parties who are the mainstream political parties here, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, need to recognise that politics is being hollowed out, because there are whole masses of people who are going to go either to the nasty extremes of voting for anti-immigration parties, as they have seen in other bits of Europe. In Greece, for example, you had the numbers of people who went to Syriza for a good, positive left alternative, also the numbers who went to Golden Dawn for a much nastier far-right alternative. So I think that the Social Democratic and the Conservative parties across the whole of Europe need to look to harness the energy that still exists in society before it's too late. And obviously on this weekend, we've got the Spanish elections, which is exactly what is a good example of where you've had a social movement rising up and forming a political party, in this case Podemos, which has then given people an avenue, a channel through which to express their political wish. So I think that's the sort of lesson that people need to learn, and particularly for the Labour Party. You're now seeing a situation where our excitement in Britain behind a Jeremy Corbyn victory is already beginning to flounder, because the Parliamentary Labour Party are beginning to gang up against him. And I think that's incredibly dangerous.
And we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time, John Hilary, Jonathan Portes, and Charlie Wells. And thank you for watching as well. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, that is aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that is facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team, bye for now.